In the silent, biting cold of the great northern territories, a man could be judged by the weight of his winter gear. A heavy stack of wool blankets and the thick, oiled hide of a bear were the accepted price of survival, a burden carried on the back that promised a shield against the killing frost. Yet, Caleb carried only a canvas roll, no thicker than his arm, and the men in the settlement of Providence Creek watched him with a mixture of pity and scorn. They saw a man courting death, a fool who had traded the wisdom of generations for a strange, flimsy contraption of his own design. They did not see the meticulous layers, the pockets of trapped air, or the profound understanding of cold that had been born from the bitterest loss. They saw a light burden and assumed a light mind, never imagining that within that simple canvas roll lay a revolution that would one day keep men like them alive when their heavy, trusted blankets had become frozen shrouds. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of quiet ingenuity and frontier resilience fascinate you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale is even more remarkable. The memory that drove Caleb was as sharp and cold as a shard of river ice. It was from the winter before, a season that had started with promise and ended in a silent, white expanse of grief. He and Jacob had been partners on the trap lines for 5 years, a seamless unit that moved through the wilderness with practiced efficiency. They understood the language of the snow, the habits of the marten and the fox, and the unforgiving calculus of the cold. They believed, as all men did, in the sanctity of their gear. Their bedrolls were immense things, layered wool blankets wrapped in heavy bison hides, weighing nearly 50 pounds apiece. They were cumbersome, but they were proven. The tragedy began with a simple misstep. They were crossing the Serpent River, which was mostly frozen but had a treacherous channel of fast-moving black water in its center. The ice on the far bank was slick and deceptive, coated with a thin layer of fresh powder. Jacob, leading the way, found a patch of it. His footing gave way instantly, and he went down hard, not into the water, but onto the unforgiving shelf of ice. The fall was awkward, and he landed with his heavy pack beneath him, but the real damage was unseen. He had cracked the ice crust, and a wave of frigid water had washed over his legs and, more critically, over the bottom half of his bedroll lashed to his pack. He stood up, cursing the cold that seeped into his boots, but they were less than a day from their line cabin. They pressed on, the temperature dropping with the sun. By the time they made camp, the water that had soaked into Jacob's wool blankets had begun to freeze. The material, once soft and insulating, was becoming a solid block of ice. They built a large fire, the flames leaping high into the darkening sky, and Jacob tried to thaw the roll. He draped it as close to the fire as he dared, but the process was agonizingly slow. The outer layers steamed and dripped, while the core remained stiff and frozen. The cold that night was a living thing. It pressed in from the darkness, a physical weight that stole the heat from the fire and the life from the air. Caleb, wrapped in his own dry blankets, watched his friends struggle. Jacob's bedroll was a cruel mockery of shelter. The parts that had thawed were now damp and clammy, offering no warmth, only a chilling moisture that leached his body heat faster than the fire could replace it. The parts that remained frozen were as useless as a sheet of rock. He shivered violently, his teeth chattering in a rhythm that seemed to shake his very bones. "Share my roll," Caleb had insisted, trying to unfold his own blankets. "No," Jacob had chattered, his pride as frozen as his gear. "You'll freeze too. I'll manage." But he did not manage. He spent the night huddled by the fire, turning constantly, trying to drive the deep cold from his body. Caleb stayed awake with him, feeding the flames, watching the life in his friend's eyes dim with each passing hour. By dawn, the shivering had stopped. Caleb knew this was a bad sign, the final, deceptive stage before the end. Jacob's words were slurred, his movements slow and clumsy. He lay down, pulling the half-frozen, half-damp wool over himself, and fell into a sleep from which he would never wake. Caleb found him in the morning, dusted with a fine layer of new snow, his expression peaceful. The great, heavy bedroll was frozen solid around him. It had become his coffin. Caleb had to use his hatchet to chip the frozen wool away from his friend's body. He looked at the heavy, useless mass of material and felt a cold fury replace his grief. It was not the river or the fall that had killed Jacob. It was the weight. It was the wool. It was the conventional wisdom that said heavier was warmer, that bulk was safety. That wisdom was a lie, and Jacob had paid the price for their belief in it. The journey back to Providence Creek was a blur of exhaustion and sorrow. Caleb left Jacob's gear where it lay, a frozen monument to a fatal flaw. He arrived at the settlement, a man hollowed out by loss. But beneath the grief, a new thought was taking root. It was a rejection of the way things were done. The problem was not an accident, it was a failure of design. Men hauled immense weight into the wilderness, and the moment that weight got wet, it transformed from a tool of survival into an instrument of death. Everyone accepted this risk as part of life on the frontier. Caleb, alone with his anger and his loss, no longer did. He would not just mourn Jacob, he would solve the problem that killed him. From that day forward, Caleb was a man consumed. The rhythms of his life, once dictated by the trapping seasons and the needs of his small homestead, now revolved around a singular, obsessive purpose. He neglected his lines, trading only what he needed to acquire basic supplies. The rest of his time was spent in a state of intense observation and research. He became a student of the cold, not as an enemy to be endured, but as a force with rules that could be understood and exploited. His first step was to confirm his suspicion that the problem was universal. He visited the cabins of other trappers and settlers, asking to see their winter gear. Under the guise of comparing notes or seeking advice, he examined their bedrolls. They were all the same, thick wool blankets, sometimes with a layer of canvas, and a heavy outer skin of bison, bear, or moose. He would ask them, "What do you do if it gets wet?" The answers were always variations on a theme. They would shrug, their faces grim. "You build a big fire, you dry it. If you can't, you're in trouble." It was a fatalistic acceptance of a known danger. Caleb began to look at the world differently. He stopped looking at how men fought the cold and started looking at how nature itself survived it. He spent days tracking foxes, not for their pelts, but to observe them. He watched a red fox curl into a tight ball during a blizzard, its thick, bushy tail wrapped around its nose, and emerge hours later, seemingly untouched by the storm. He managed to acquire a fox pelt and studied it closely, not as a commodity, but as a piece of engineering. He saw that it was not just one layer of fur. There was a dense, soft undercoat and longer, coarser guard hairs. The magic, he realized, was not in the thickness, but in the space between the hairs. It was trapped air. He watched ptarmigans, birds that stayed through the harshest winters. He saw them dive into deep snowdrifts to roost, using the snow itself as an insulator. Again, the principle was the same. The snow was mostly air, trapped between delicate crystals. Air was the barrier. He thought of the walls of his own cabin, the chinking between the logs. It was the mud and moss that filled the gaps, stopping the movement of air that kept the warmth in. Heat did not like to travel through still air. This line of thinking led him to the settlement's oldest and most reclusive resident, a man named Finn. Finn had been a trapper for 50 years, living a semi-nomadic life before settling into a small, isolated cabin upriver. He was considered an eccentric, a man who understood the wilderness better than he understood people. Caleb found him smoking his pipe on a stump outside his dwelling, his face a roadmap of wrinkles carved by 1,000 winter winds. Caleb did not waste time with pleasantries. He described Jacob's death, the frozen blankets, and the fury it had ignited in him. He then explained his observations of the fox and the ptarmigan. He asked the old man, "You've seen more winters than any 10 men here. What is the secret? How do they survive with so little?" Finn took a long draw from his pipe, the smoke pluming in the crisp air. He looked at Caleb with eyes that held no judgment, only a deep, weary understanding. "You're asking the right questions, son," he said, his voice raspy. "Most men, they think a bear is warm because he's got a thick hide. They think a bison is warm because he's got a heavy coat." He tapped the bowl of his pipe on the stump. "They're wrong. It ain't the fur that keeps the fox warm. It's the air trapped in the fur. It ain't the feathers that keep the bird warm. It's the air trapped under the feathers. Warmth is just life, and life is just air. The cold is death, and death is just the wind that carries your air away." It was a simple statement, but for Caleb, it was a profound revelation. The eureka moment. The entire paradigm shifted. The goal was not to pile on heavy, thick layers of insulation. The goal was to trap as much still air as possible in the lightest, most water-resistant package imaginable. Heavy wool blankets, when wet, lost all their trapped air. Their fibers matted together, replaced by water, which then froze. The very thing meant to save you became a conductor of cold. Finn gave him one more piece of advice. He pointed to his own coat, a patchwork garment of caribou hide. "This hide is brain-tanned," he said. "Stays supple even when it's freezing. But the real trick is what the old people knew. Tallow and soot. Rub it into the seams. Keeps the water out that lets the hide breathe. Water is the enemy, not the cold. The cold just is. Water is what carries the cold into your bones." Caleb returned to his homestead with a fire in his eyes. The grief for Jacob had not lessened, but it had been forged into a tool. He now had a concrete plan. He spent the next week sketching designs on scraps of parchment, calculating layers and dimensions. He knew what he needed, and it was not available in the woods around his cabin. His trip to the trading post at Fort George caused a stir. It was a 2-day journey, and he returned with a mule laden with unusual supplies. He bought the largest bolts of canvas the post had, along with several tins of linseed oil. He purchased fine needles, the kind used for sailmaking, and spools of waxed linen thread. He bought bags of salt for curing hides and a block of beeswax. To the other men at the post, it looked like the shopping list of a man outfitting a boat, not preparing for a winter on the trap lines. The questions and curious looks followed him all the way back to Providence Creek. He offered no explanations, his silence only deepening the community's suspicion that Jacob's death had unhinged him. His obsession had a plan, and now it had materials. The construction began in the late summer as the days grew shorter and a chill returned to the morning air. Caleb cleared a space in his small barn, turning it into a workshop. The project consumed him, a methodical and relentless process that blocked out everything else. He worked from dawn until his eyes could no longer focus by the dim light of his lantern. His young son, Daniel, a quiet boy of 10, became his silent apprentice. The boy did not understand the complex theories of trapped air and thermal dynamics, but he understood his father's grief and the fierce determination that had grown from it. The first stage was the most odious, preparing the hides. Caleb had spent weeks hunting rabbits, not for meat, but for their pelts. He needed dozens of them, prized for their lightness and the dense, soft quality of their fur. He and Daniel worked together, skinning the animals with precision. Then came the long process of scraping and curing, using the salt he had purchased. The barn filled with the sharp, metallic smell of the work. Daniel, uncomplaining, would stretch the small hides on wooden frames, his small hands learning the rhythm of the task. While the rabbit pelts cured, Caleb turned his attention to the outer shell. This was to be the shield against the world, the barrier against wind and water. He unrolled the heavy canvas on the barn floor, the sheer size of it covering nearly the entire space. Using a piece of charcoal, he meticulously drew the pattern he had designed, a large rectangle with a rounded hood extension at one end. He cut the material with a heavy shear, the sound of the blade slicing through the thick fabric echoing in the quiet barn. He then set about waterproofing it. He mixed the linseed oil with a small amount of beeswax, heating it over a small fire outside until it was a thin, fragrant liquid. For 3 days, he painted the canvas with the mixture, his arm aching with the repetitive motion. He applied one coat, let it dry in the sun, then applied another and another until the canvas was stiff and slick with a dark, oily sheen. Water, when splashed on it, now beat it up and rolled off without leaving a trace of moisture. The community's curiosity soon curdled into open mockery. Men would pass by his homestead on their way to the woods and stop, watching him work. His nearest neighbor, a pragmatic and deeply conventional man named Marcus, was the most vocal skeptic. Marcus was a good man by the settlement's standards, honest and hard-working, but he had no patience for ideas that strayed from the well-trodden path of tradition. "What in God's name are you building, Caleb?" Marcus asked one afternoon, leaning on the fence that separated their properties. He gestured towards the huge, oily sheet of canvas drying in the sun. "You planning to sail away from the winter?" Caleb did not look up from his work, his hands busy stitching a seam. "A bedroll," he answered simply. Marcus let out a short, incredulous laugh. "A bedroll? Made of canvas and rabbit skins? Man, you'll freeze solid before the first real snow. You need wool, thick wool, and a heavy hide. You know this. We all know this." "Wool gets wet," Caleb said, his voice flat, "and heavy is a liability." "Heavy is warm," Marcus countered, his tone hardening with the certainty of a man repeating a sacred truth. "It's always been that way. What you're doing, it's foolish. It's a waste of good time and money. Jacob's passing was a tragedy, a terrible accident. But you can't change the nature of the cold by stitching together rabbit pelts." He shook his head, a look of genuine concern mixed with his condescension. The project soon earned a nickname in the settlement, Caleb's Folly. The name was spoken with chuckles in the small trading post, and with sad shakes of the head by the women who worried for his boy. Caleb ignored them. The mockery was a distant noise, like the buzzing of flies, easily dismissed. His focus was absolute. He began assembling the core of the system, the insulation layer. He took the cured rabbit pelts, which were now soft and pliable. He did not stitch them together edge to form a solid blanket. Instead, he created a sort of quilt. He laid out a large piece of thin, tanned deerskin he had prepared as an inner liner. Upon this, he began to stitch the rabbit pelts, but he did so loosely, sewing them down only at their centers. This created a baffling of soft fur where the edges of the pelts overlapped, forming hundreds, if not thousands, of small, distinct air pockets. It was a painstaking process. Each stitch had to be perfect, strong enough to hold, but loose enough to allow the fur to remain lofty. Daniel helped, threading needles and holding the hides in place, his quiet presence a source of unspoken support. The hidden genius of the design was in these subtle, non-obvious details. It was not just a bag of fur, it was a carefully engineered system for trapping air. He created 2 such layers of baffled rabbit fur, separated by another thin sheet of deerskin. The result was a thick but astonishingly light mattress of fur and air. When laid out, it was nearly 4 inches thick, but it could be compressed to a fraction of that size. The final step was to sew this multi-layered core into the waterproof canvas shell. He worked the sailmaker's needle and waxed thread through the tough, oiled fabric, his fingers growing raw and calloused. He created a series of leather straps and buckles along the side, allowing the roll to be sealed tightly, creating an almost airtight cocoon. The hood was designed to fold over, leaving only a small opening for breathing, a tunnel to the outside world that would minimize heat loss. He finished it in late October. The first flurries of snow were beginning to dust the high peaks, and the air had the sharp, clean bite of impending winter. The final product lay on his barn floor, a testament to months of obsessive labor. Rolled up and secured with its leather straps, it was a compact cylinder, 3 feet long and just over a foot in diameter. Caleb lifted it. It weighed no more than 12 pounds. He compared it to his old bedroll, the heavy combination of wool and bison hide that still sat in the corner of his cabin, a relic of his former life. That one weighed close to 50 pounds and was twice the size when rolled. The difference was staggering. Daniel looked at the new creation with a sense of awe, touching the slick canvas. Caleb felt a flicker of something he had not felt since Jacob's death. Not quite hope, but a grim satisfaction. The theory was sound, the construction was complete. Now, it needed to be tested. The project was finished just as the season of danger began its slow, inexorable arrival. The vibrant colors of autumn had faded to a uniform brown and gray, and the sky overhead was often a flat, metallic sheet. The wind, which had been a gentle whisper through the summer pines, now carried a serrated edge, a promise of the brutal cold to come. The other men in Providence Creek were in the final stages of their winter preparations, checking the chinking on their cabins, splitting and stacking the last of their firewood, and oiling their heavy wool and leather gear. They saw Caleb's strange canvas roll with continued disbelief, a foolish experiment on the cusp of a deadly reckoning. The first test came sooner than expected. A cold front swept down from the north, a vanguard of the true winter. It was not a blizzard, but a sharp, punishing snap of cold that sent temperatures plummeting far below freezing overnight. The ground hardened like iron, and a brittle crust of frost coated every surface, glittering in the pale morning light. It was the kind of night that served as a warning, a reminder to respect the coming season. For Caleb, it was an opportunity. He announced his intention to his son that evening. "I'm going to sleep outside tonight, Daniel, by the creek." The boy's eyes widened with concern, but he did not question his father. He had watched the meticulous construction of the bedroll, had felt the impossible lightness of it, and his faith in his father was absolute. Caleb packed a small haversack with a tin cup and a little jerky, but nothing else. He carried no blankets, no extra hides, no axe to build a large fire. He walked out of his warm cabin carrying only the canvas roll, a deliberate and stark demonstration of his faith in his own creation. Marcus, his neighbor, saw him from his window. He watched Caleb walk towards the woods, a lean figure against the fading light, and shook his head in profound disbelief. He said to his wife, "He's finally lost his senses completely. He'll be found frozen solid in the morning." Caleb found a sheltered spot beneath a thick stand of spruce trees, the ground protected from the wind. He did not build a fire. A fire was a variable he did not want. The test had to be pure, a direct contest between his system and the raw cold. He unbuckled the leather straps and unrolled the bed. The oiled canvas made a crisp, crackling sound in the frozen air. The inner layers of rabbit fur fluffed up as they were released from compression, the trapped air expanding within the baffles. He slipped out of his heavy boots and outer coat and slid into the opening. The initial sensation was neutral, neither warm nor cold. It was simply an absence of the biting wind. He pulled the hood over his head, adjusting the opening until only his nose and mouth were exposed to the frigid air. He lay still, his senses on high alert, listening to his own breathing and the profound silence of the frozen woods. He was acutely aware of the temperature outside his canvas cocoon, a palpable entity pressing down on him. He expected a slow, seeping chill, the gradual victory of the cold over his body heat. But it never came. Instead, a remarkable thing happened. Within minutes, the faint warmth generated by his own body was captured by the layers of fur and air. The space around him began to warm, not to the heat of a fire, but to a comfortable, stable equilibrium. The cold was not defeated, it was held at bay. The oiled canvas shell blocked the wind completely, and the layers of trapped air prevented his body heat from escaping into the night. He could feel the intense cold just an inch beyond the canvas, a vast ocean of it, but it could not touch him. He was a stone warmed by an internal fire, protected by a perfectly engineered shell. He fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, the most restful he had had in a year. He awoke to the first light of dawn. A fine powder of snow had fallen overnight, dusting his bedroll. He pushed the hood back and took a breath. The air was so cold it felt sharp in his lungs, stinging his nostrils. But inside the roll, he was perfectly warm and, crucially, perfectly dry. There was no condensation, no clammy dampness from his own breath. The small breathing hole and the breathable nature of the inner deerskin liner had wicked the moisture away. He slid out of the roll, put on his coat and boots, and felt the brutal shock of the ambient temperature. It was a testament to the effectiveness of his shelter. The system worked. He rolled up the bed, the canvas still flexible despite the deep cold, and walked back to his cabin. As he approached, he saw Marcus outside, feeding his livestock, his breath pluming in thick white clouds. Marcus stopped and stared, his expression one of utter astonishment. He had clearly expected to see a man half frozen, defeated, or worse. Instead, he saw Caleb walking with a steady gait, his face showing no signs of hardship. "You survived," Marcus said, the words a statement of disbelief rather than a question. "I slept well," Caleb replied, his tone even. "Warmer than I've been in a wool roll on a night half as cold." Marcus looked at the compact canvas roll under Caleb's arm. He still could not comprehend it. He searched for a different explanation, a way to reconcile what he was seeing with what he knew to be true. "It was luck," he declared, his skepticism finding a new foothold. "The wind must have died down. You found a sheltered spot. It's a fluke, Caleb, a dangerous one. Don't press your luck with that thing." He turned back to his chores, dismissing the evidence before his eyes. The glowing warmth of Caleb's success was a minor curiosity, a strange anomaly. To the rest of Providence Creek, Caleb's folly had survived one night. But winter was long, and its true tests were yet to come. The community's skepticism, though shaken, remained firmly in place. The next few weeks passed in a deceptive calm. The initial cold snap receded, replaced by a period of gray, overcast days and relatively mild temperatures for the season. The snow held off. To the residents of Providence Creek, it felt like a reprieve, a gift of extra time to prepare. To Caleb, it was a period of quiet waiting. He had validated his design for himself, but he knew the true proof would only come with a trial by fire, or rather, by ice. He used the time to make a second, smaller version of the bedroll for his son, Daniel, teaching the boy the principles of its construction as he worked. Then, the sky began to change. The familiar gray sheet overhead darkened to a bruised purple, and the wind, which had been inconsistent, picked up a low, mournful howl that did not cease. It was a sound the old-timers knew and feared. It was the harbinger of a true northern blizzard, the kind that became the stuff of legends, a storm that would be used as a benchmark for decades to come. The snow began not as flakes, but as a fine granular powder like sand, driven almost horizontally by the wind. Within hours, the world dissolved into a maelstrom of white. Visibility dropped to zero. The line between ground and sky vanished. The wind shrieked, a constant, high-pitched assault on the ears, punctuated by violent gusts that shook the log cabins to their foundations. The temperature plummeted, not by degrees, but by tens of degrees. It was a storm that did not just bring cold, it manufactured it, a relentless engine of wind and ice. Inside his cabin, Caleb was calm. He had brought in a massive supply of firewood, his larder was full, and his home was secure. He and Daniel sat by the fire, listening to the fury of the storm outside. For them, it was an inconvenience, a force to be respected and waited out. For the rest of Providence Creek, it was the beginning of a desperate struggle. The blizzard raged for 3 days without pause. The snow piled up in monstrous drifts, burying fences, sheds, and in some cases, the entire lower portions of cabins. The relentless wind found every crack and crevice, driving fine, powdery snow into homes that had been considered weatherproof. Families huddled around their fires, stuffing rags and moss into the gaps, fighting a losing battle against the invasive cold. The first systemic failure began with the wood piles. Most settlers kept their wood stacked outside, close to the cabin door for convenience. But the immense drifts and the cement-like consistency of the wind-packed snow made accessing it a life-threatening ordeal. A man could become disoriented and lost in the white chaos just a few feet from his own door. Some ran out of the wood they had brought inside and were forced to start burning furniture to stay warm. The next failure was structural. The sheer weight of the accumulated snow was immense. On the 4th day, the roof of the settlement's small chapel groaned under the load and then collapsed with a deafening crack, the sound swallowed almost instantly by the howling wind. The weight was too much for traditional construction, built for average winters, not for a legendary one. Caleb's world remained one of relative peace and warmth. But he watched the storm with a growing sense of unease, not for himself, but for his neighbors. He knew their gear, their homes, their mindset. They were prepared for winter, but this was not winter. This was a war. The crisis arrived at his door on the 5th day. A frantic pounding, nearly lost in the gale, made him start. He opened the door a crack, and a figure, caked in snow and ice, stumbled inside. It was Marcus. His face was pale with fear and cold, his beard frozen into a solid mass. "Caleb, you have to help me," he gasped, his body racked with shivers. "The roof, a main beam over the hearth, cracked from the snow. It's going to collapse. We had to put the fire out for fear it would bring the whole thing down on us. My wife, my children, they're freezing. We can't stay there." The situation was dire. Marcus's cabin was less than 200 yards away, a trivial distance in normal weather. In the blizzard, it was a perilous journey across a frozen, featureless wasteland. To be exposed to that wind and cold for even a few minutes without proper protection would be fatal. Caleb did not hesitate. "Daniel, get your mother's warmest cloaks. Marcus, listen to me carefully." He grabbed the 2 bedrolls, his and the one he had made for his son. He unrolled them on the floor. "We will wrap your wife and youngest child in these. They are light. We can carry them. Your older boy will have to walk between us." Marcus stared at the flimsy-looking canvas rolls. In his moment of ultimate crisis, he was being asked to trust the very object he had ridiculed for months. "That thing? Caleb, with respect, we need heavy hides, anything." "There is no time, Marcus." Caleb's voice was like a whip crack, sharp and absolute. "Those heavy hides would be impossible to carry in this wind, and they will not keep the wind out. This will. This is what it was made for. Now, do you trust me or not?" Defeated, terrified, and with no other options, Marcus nodded. The rescue was a nightmare of sound and fury. Caleb and Marcus, bundled to their eyes, ventured into the white chaos. They wrapped Marcus's wife and his small daughter in the canvas rolls, which acted as perfect windproof stretchers. The material, slick with its oil treatment, shed the driving snow. The 2 men, with Marcus's older son clinging to them, fought their way through the waist-deep drifts, leaning into a wind that felt like a solid wall. The journey took almost 30 minutes, a desperate, lung-searing battle for every foot. When they finally burst back into the warmth and safety of Caleb's cabin, the contrast was absolute. Marcus's family, when unwrapped from the bedrolls, were cold and frightened, but they were unharmed. Their core temperatures had been protected from the murderous wind. They had been cocooned in a bubble of still air, the very principle Caleb had staked everything on. They huddled by Caleb's fire, their shivering slowly subsiding, their eyes wide with the shock of their ordeal and the miracle of their rescue. Marcus stood in the center of the warm room, looking from his safe family to Caleb, and then to the simple canvas roll lying on the floor. In that moment, the world he knew, the world of conventional wisdom and accepted truths, shattered completely. He had mocked this object, called it foolishness, and it had just saved the lives of everyone he loved. It was not a fluke. It was not luck. It was genius. The blizzard howled outside, a cry of impotent rage, but inside Caleb's cabin, there was only the quiet crackle of the fire and the profound, undeniable weight of absolute vindication. The Great Blizzard. The storm that would be known for a generation as the White Death finally broke after 8 days. When the wind ceased and the sun emerged, it revealed a world transformed, buried, and broken. The settlement of Providence Creek was a scene of devastation. 2 cabins had been completely crushed by snow. Half a dozen more were severely damaged, like Marcus's. Tragically, an elderly couple, unable to reach their woodpile, had been found frozen in their home. The storm had exacted a terrible price, exposing the fragility of their preparations and the deadly flaws in their conventional wisdom. In the aftermath, as the community began the arduous task of digging out and rebuilding, a new kind of silence fell over the settlement. It was a silence of humility and reflection. The story of Marcus's rescue spread quickly, whispered from neighbor to neighbor. They had all seen Caleb as the fool, the eccentric obsessed with his flimsy contraption. Now, they saw him as the only one who had been truly prepared. His cabin was undamaged, his family safe, and his strange invention had been the instrument of a miracle. A week after the storm, Marcus appeared at Caleb's door. He was not the same man. The arrogance and certainty were gone, replaced by a deep, quiet humility. He did not carry himself with the bluster of a man who knew the ways of the world, but with the caution of one who had just discovered how little he actually understood. He held his hat in his hands, twisting the brim nervously. "Caleb," he began, his voice low. "I don't have words to thank you. You saved my family. I was wrong about everything. I was a fool, and I am sorry." He paused, taking a breath. "I came to ask if you would teach me. I need to build one of those roles, for myself, for my boy. I will pay you for the materials, for your time, whatever you ask." Caleb looked at the humbled man before him. He saw no triumph in Marcus's admission, only a shared understanding of the stakes. He felt no desire for payment or apology. His motivation had never been about proving others wrong. It had been about preventing what happened to Jacob from ever happening again. "There is no payment, Marcus," Caleb said, his voice gentle, "and nothing to be sorry for. Come inside. I will show you how it is done. I will show anyone who wants to learn." And so, Caleb's barn, once the site of solitary, obsessive work, became a classroom. One by one, then in small groups, the men of Providence Creek came to him. They brought rabbit pelts, canvas, and whatever materials they could trade for. Caleb taught them patiently, explaining the principles with a clarity born of deep understanding. He showed them how to treat the canvas, how to cure the hides, and most importantly, how to create the baffled layers that trapped the air. He shared his knowledge freely, without any sense of ownership or pride. The innovation was not his. It belonged to anyone who needed it to survive. Over the next year, the sight of heavy, cumbersome bedrolls vanished from Providence Creek. In their place were the compact, lightweight canvas rolls, each one a slight variation on Caleb's original design as men adapted it to their own needs and materials. The settlement had not just adopted a new piece of gear, it had undergone a fundamental shift in its understanding of the wilderness. They had learned that survival was not about brute force and heavy materials, but about intelligence, efficiency, and working with the laws of nature instead of against them. The idea's journey beyond their small, isolated valley began the following summer with the arrival of a man named Alistair. He was a surveyor, part of a government expedition tasked with mapping the vast, uncharted territories to the north. He was a man of science and precision, accustomed to documenting the world in terms of lines, elevations, and figures. He stayed in Providence Creek for 2 weeks to resupply and gather local knowledge about the terrain. During his stay, he saw the ubiquitous canvas bedrolls. Intrigued by their lightness and the universal praise the settlers had for them, he sought out Caleb. He listened for over an hour as Caleb, using sketches in the dirt, explained the principles of trapped air, wind resistance, and moisture management. Alistair, with his engineer's mind, immediately grasped the genius of the design. He saw it not just as a piece of frontier craft, but as a brilliant solution to a complex thermodynamic problem. "This is remarkable," Alistair said, his notebook already filled with detailed sketches and notes. "The efficiency of it, the weight-to-warmth ratio is unlike anything I've ever seen. This should be standard issue for our survey teams, for the mounted police, for anyone operating in the north." When Alistair left Providence Creek, he carried with him not just maps of the mountains and rivers, but also the detailed plans for Caleb's invention. True to his word, he included the design in his official report to his superiors. The report praised the ingenious frontier bedroll for its superior performance in extreme cold. The design was eventually incorporated into a government-issued guide for northern travel and settlement. But in the process of this formal adoption, the origin of the idea became blurred, then lost. The The guide attributed the design to anonymous trappers in the Yukon region. It was given a generic, official-sounding name, the Standard Arctic Roll. The name of Caleb, the man who had forged a revolution from grief and obsession, was never mentioned. His creation had been anonymized, becoming a piece of common sense, its genesis forgotten. Decades passed, the world changed, and the frontier slowly tamed. Providence Creek grew from a small collection of cabins into a proper town, with a sawmill, a church with a new roof, and a general store. The stories of the White Death blizzard became the stuff of local legend, a tale told by grandparents to wide-eyed children, a reminder of the harshness of the old days. The lightweight canvas bedroll, or the trapper's roll as it was locally known, was so common, so fundamental to life in the North, that no one even thought to question where it came from. It was simply the way things were done. Caleb lived a long and quiet life. He never sought credit for his invention. He saw other men grow prosperous using his design to travel farther and trap more efficiently, and he felt no envy, only a quiet satisfaction. His reward was not fame or fortune, but the knowledge that in the cabins all around him, families were safer. He had seen the flaw in the world that had taken his friend, and he had corrected it. That was enough. His son Daniel grew into a capable young man, inheriting his father's quiet competence and deep understanding of the natural world. When Caleb passed away in his sleep at the age of 78, his death was peaceful. He was buried in the small cemetery on the hill overlooking the town. His gravestone was simple, carved from local granite. It bore only his name, the years of his life, and a short, humble inscription chosen by his son, Caleb. A good husband, a good father. There was no mention of his true legacy, no epitaph for the obsessive innovator who had redefined survival for an entire generation. His contribution was too fundamental to be noticed, like the air itself. His impact, however, was immeasurable. Though his name was forgotten, his idea endured, spreading across the vast northern expanse of the continent. It was carried by trappers, prospectors, surveyors, and settlers. It saved countless lives, an invisible shield against the killing cold in 1,000 lonely camps and on 1,000 miles of frozen trail. Years later, abandoned cabins would be discovered by new generations, and inside, they would find the decaying remains of a canvas roll, its rabbit fur turned to dust, a silent artifact of a forgotten revolution. The number of men who returned home safely, who woke to see another dawn because of the light, warm cocoon Caleb had designed, could never be counted. It was a quiet, anonymous legacy, as vast and as silent as the winter snow, a testament to a man who, when faced with tragedy, chose not to curse the darkness, but to meticulously, brilliantly engineer a better kind of light.